Mr. Andrew is up next on stage. He'll be talking about progress, performance, and personalization, and using assessment to guide the learning of a student. He's the Deputy Director of Digital and New Product Development Team at Cambridge Assessment English. All yours, sir.
Great, hi, good afternoon everyone. So I'm Andrew Nye from Cambridge Assessment English, and I've worked there for about 12 years now. And before that I worked in English language teaching. And when I started my teaching career straight out of university, it was before the days of the internet, and not really much at that time existed in the way of computer-assisted language learning. And the standard model in English language teaching at that time was known as the 3 Ps: presentation, practice, production. And the idea was that a part of language was packaged up into some kind of unit or chunk that could be realistically dealt with by the teacher during the course of a lesson. So that some part of the language was presented to the students, and then they practiced it, and then they produced it. And so they progressed from input to output. But that model was not without its criticisms, because it assumes a very linear, mechanistic view of language learning. That you learn one thing at a time, bit by bit, and then that knowledge accumulates. And so what you've learned on Monday is available for you to use on Tuesday. But language learning doesn't work like that, as we know. It's much more organic than that, where you take 2 steps forward and then 1 step back, or 1 step forward and 2 steps back. So what I think is interesting is where we are now in terms of the technology available to us, it's possible to think about language learning differently, and in terms of a different 3 Ps, performance, progress, and personalization, hence the title of my talk. So in assessment, there are typically 2 assessment paradigms: summative assessment and formative assessment. And these are often seen as a binary choice, but they're not mutually exclusive, and these 2 paradigms can actually work together to serve the double duty of evaluation and learning. So in a question like this, what is the capital of Estonia? If you don't know the answer, it's quite easy to work that out through a process of elimination. This question requires a bit more mental processing. And that question is a complete head scratcher, really. And so the point is that as you progress along those 3 questions, learning and evaluation, learning and assessment becomes much more closely interlinked. And in good assessment tasks, there's much more cognitive engagement and much more deeper processing going on. So good tasks give you information, and good teachers are constantly gathering data about how and how much their students are learning, so that essentially you're learning and being assessed at the same time. And assessment and learning can work together in a kind of virtuous cycle, a virtuous circle, that in Cambridge we call learning-oriented assessment. And this is where assessment takes place at the centre of learning, so that it guides learning. And this image is of what would typically happen in a face-to-face teaching context. So starting at the top of the diagram, where it says current task, the teacher would select a task for the students to do. They would do some kind of language activity. The teacher would observe what's happening in the class, would interpret what he or she sees, would make a record of that activity. That record would then feed into the teacher's strategy. She would update her teaching objectives, select another task for the students, and so it goes on and on. And that LOA cycle would then feed into a broader LOA syllabus, which you can see on the left, and the Common European Framework of Reference levels going up the left-hand side. But there's a couple of issues with that. Firstly, it assumes good task design, so that learning and assessment do work hand in hand. And secondly, how do you cope with large numbers of students in a class? So a teacher can't possibly be expected to be gathering all this data if she's got 30, 40, 50 students in a class. She can't be watching them all and observing what they're all doing. And I think what's interesting about this now is that advances in digital technology is one reason why learning and assessment can be more integrated and can cope with large numbers of students in a class. So I work in the digital and new product development team in Cambridge, and we work at the intersection of emerging technology trends, learning and assessment. And it's a journey into the unknown for us, and we're doing a load of experiments to see what works and what doesn't work. And I'm going to tell you very briefly about 3 of the things that we're involved in at the moment and what that could all add up to in terms of the 3 P's of the title. So firstly, diagnostic testing. Learners consistently tell us that they want more detailed feedback on how they can improve and how they can reach their goals more quickly. And good diagnostic tests are surprisingly rare, so we're developing our capability in this area. For these reasons, basically. For learners and teachers, saves them time and effort. For clients and partners, we can give them something that's customizable and embeddable into their platforms. Learners obviously get detailed analysis about the diagnostic test that they've done, and teachers would get information a bit like this that you can see on the screen. So that's all very well, using new technologies to gather data, but in this Summative model, down at the bottom of the model, substitution and augmentation is kind of what we're doing with diagnostic testing. We're gathering data down there. But the new kind of emotional and personalized experiences that we want to achieve with technology is not just about gathering data. So the Summative model captures this quite well, and the real transformative gold from technology comes up at the top in redefinition, and we'll come back to this model a bit later on. And we've been investigating whether games-based assessment is something that can provide that engaging and emotional connection in language learning. And the reason we're looking at games-based assessment is that one of the pain points that we constantly hear about assessment is about the stress that's involved in it. Students constantly tell us that assessments are just not enjoyable. So the question we were asking was whether we could use a video game to be a valid medium for a language assessment. And we made a minimum viable product in 6 months for an A2 test, fairly low level, of receptive skills, so reading and listening skills. And what did we learn from that? Well, we found out that some tasks were a bit more difficult than we expected. We found out that both male and female students found that test much more engaging than a paper-based equivalent, and the teachers told us how immersed their students were when they were doing it. So overall, the students preferred the format. It was found to encourage perseverance and problem solving, which is another important part of learning. But we found that it was important to make sure that the assessment wasn't the main objective of the game. It didn't seem to be, a games-based assessment didn't seem to be very well suited as a summative test, and it was much more suited as a learning tool. So we're now working with a company, a London-based company called Wibu, who've developed a game called Ruby Ray, and we are linking that game to one of our young learner exams. And we've created some additional teaching and learning resources so that that game can be used by teachers as a classroom product to engage their students in learning. And the third example I just briefly want to tell you about is something that we're doing with our partners in the wider university in Cambridge, and it's called Write and Improve. And as the name suggests, it's something where a student can write a response and then submit their text, and the system will review it in a matter of seconds. So the student would get feedback a bit like you're seeing on the screen now, and they would then resubmit the text again and again and gradually improve on their piece of work. So basically it does exactly what a teacher would do. It doesn't correct everything, it focuses on areas of improvement. And there's a version of Write and Improve for teachers. So on the left, each thick blue line there represents a series of responses by a student to a task. And the width of the line demonstrates the amount of progress. It demonstrates the range of scores that a student has got on that task. So the longer the blue line, the more the student has progressed. So those are three examples of how we're experimenting with various verticals in this language learning space. But the really interesting question, I think, is how do we put all that together into some kind of digital ecosystem, and how do we make all that make sense as a whole? And as we develop more and more innovations in learning, we're stuck in a very traditional assessment system, so that the cognitive dissonance between learning and assessment is becoming more and more extreme. And the reason for that is that assessments just haven't evolved at the same pace as learning has. So there's just an increasing disconnect between what schools value and what they measure. And the system has been like this for a very long time, and we can only fix that really by looking at the whole system. There's nothing more ridiculous than adding technology to a system that isn't working, because you're just left with all the suboptimal elements of the system. So what we need to do is use technology to change that system. So back to the SAME model, we need to do way more than just substitute computer-based tests for paper-based tests. We need to be redefining how technology can facilitate non-summative assessments. And if you imagine a system or an ecosystem like Apple's, the reason you stay in the Apple ecosystem is because life is simple for you in it. It keeps adding value to you, and it keeps delighting you the longer you stay in that system. So what would a version of a language learning ecosystem be like? Well, it needs to be something that makes teaching and learning more efficient through intelligent use of data. And it also needs to be something where all the elements are interconnected, exactly like in the Apple ecosystem, and where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So learners want to optimize their learning, and they want us as educators to present them with the right thing at the right moment. And that would then combine with feedback to a teacher, which would then feed into the teacher's teaching strategy, so that teaching and learning are very tightly linked. Well, that ecosystem doesn't actually exist for us at the moment. We've tried to represent it in a couple of ways. So this is one attempt we made to represent this idea of an ecosystem, but we didn't really like that because it's a very linear approach, and it goes back to the PPP point I was making at the beginning. So then we tried again, and we came up with this, but no one could understand that, so we're not really happy with that one either. But leaving aside what it looks like and how we represent it, what would an ecosystem actually need to do, and what can we in Cambridge currently do, and what can't we do? Well, firstly, we need to have an organising framework or some kind of map of learning, so that we can place the learner at the right place on the map. And so we have a Cambridge curriculum which sets out what needs to be taught, and we have a placement test so we can measure the learner and put them on the map. I mentioned diagnostic tests before, so we can provide recommendations for learning to students. I mentioned that Apple was simple. One of the reasons that life is simple for you in the Apple system is because it knows who you are. It doesn't matter what device you log on from, Apple recognizes you. So some kind of unique identifier for a learner is really important. Teacher development is a crucial part of our ecosystem. So we do a lot of teacher development, but not in a way yet that is tightly integrated into learning. And then we need a library of online content and an algorithm to search through that online content and help present students with optimal pathways at any particular time. And we can't do that at the moment, but our sister organisation, Cambridge University Press, is working on that. So in the Apple analogy, we need to develop our music library and an algorithm to suggest the music that you might like. And we think it's possible to do that. We're very hopeful that in the next year or so, we will be able to develop this idea of a recommendation engine with optimal pathways, because it's a bit like something that I always find quite creepy when it happens to me, but really it isn't that creepy. And it's a bit like when you meet a friend for a drink in a bar, and the friend recommends to you a book or a film or a product, and then without searching for that book or product or film, you start seeing targeted web ads for it. And it's no wonder that there's this persistent rumor that Facebook uses the microphone in your phone to eavesdrop on your conversations. But there's no need for Facebook to do that, because apps and websites already hoover up so much of our data that it just feels like they're eavesdropping on us. But there are two things about this. Firstly, big tech knows us obviously much better than we realize. And secondly, each of us is far more normal than we realize. So given a little bit of information about us, both Facebook and our friends hit on the same recommendation, because our interests are far less special and we're far less predictable than we like to believe. So very quickly, last slide. All relationships are based on data and data exchange, whether with a piece of technology or with a person. And the question really for us in Cambridge is whether we can come up with a digital ecosystem that really does improve learners' lives, makes their language learning more simple and more efficient, and provides meaningful assessment as they're learning, so that they're happy to give us their data. And so in the same way that data can replicate the behavior of your best friend, but it can't replace him or her, we can use data to help learning and to augment the teacher, but it can't replace the teacher. Thank you very much.